And so that's why we're here in partnership with the Japanese church to plant the very first Christian church in Urawa. So that's a daunting but exciting thought, actually, like the very first Christian church. It sounds like we're living in the book of Acts here, you know.
For me, it was, I grew up with an interest in Japan because my mum had an interest in Japan and she had Japanese friends who had kids my age. So I got a window into Japan from a young age.
I think it was 2016. We came to Japan again, just on holiday. And God just, on that holiday, that 2-week trip, God just broke our hearts for the Japanese people. I think just seeing the sheer volume of people. And then when we do the research to find out that, you know, less than 1% Christian.
Initially for me, it was the classic getting into manga, anime, growing an obsession with Japan. And then after that, becoming a Christian and looking into missionary work. I wanted to be a missionary. And a friend at a camp said, "Oh, if you're going to go to Japan, do something useful." And I thought, oh yeah, I want to be a missionary. I love Japan. Let's look into it. So
I'm going to go for the completely non-spiritual, trivial answer. The convenience. Everything works very well, you know. The reliability of you know, trains, buses, everything's on time.
Japan's sort of outer perfection does make it a rather lovely country to live in. The forests, the lakes, the mountains, they're clean, they're beautiful, they're respected. We're in a city of 2 million people here, but it's safe. You know, children go to the park by themselves. Women can walk the streets at night by themselves.
Yeah, how good the Japanese are at the holding. Seeing something beautiful, acknowledging and celebrating that. Perhaps too much in that they worship it, but I find, I don't know if you found it at church this morning, but the service is often very reflective. And it gives space for people to, you know, dwell with their own thoughts, dwell on who God is, dwell on what Jesus has done.
I just feel my own helplessness and inadequacy so often. And that's a wonderful reminder of the need to trust in Jesus and to trust that God can be at work despite our weaknesses. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing I've learned, is that where I'm inadequate, God is able.
I think for me, it's maybe patience and persistence. Just how, yeah, in a sense, how God has been patient with us. And often I think I can forget that. And just seeing a model of Christians being faithful in following Jesus for many years, and then seeking to share their faith with their families, many whom are still not Christians, but yeah, staying faithful to God in faith, even when things look different.
I answered this question very recently, actually, and the hardest thing for me is actually just the everyday life and ministry is just 10 times, 20 times harder in Japanese. And the amount of energy it saps from me, like some people are very gifted at the language, right? But then I wouldn't say I'm gifted at the language. I get by, but just everything just takes so much more energy.
They have this concept of hone and tatamae, which means your outward feeling and your inside feeling quite separate. And generally, people will see your outside face. So very polite, very measured, very, you say the right things, you say what you think that person wants to hear, but that might be very polar opposite to what your inside feeling is. And I think it's sometimes, perhaps for people from more typical Western backgrounds, it's hard to not see that as almost as dishonesty.
I feel like you kind of get reborn as a baby, and it's especially harder for people who have experience in ministry and have like been in pastoral ministry, and they were able to do things right and do things well, and then coming to Japan where the language just like knocks you flat, you know, and you can't read your mail, like the things you could do like now you can't do, or it's really difficult to do, and so it's really extremely frustrating because you're like an adult, but it feels like you're in a baby's body, you know.
There's also like a traditional like view that it's really difficult to reach men in Japan. They're all working and different things, but the culture's changed so much. And if you go down to the gym at 9 o'clock in the morning, 10 o'clock in the morning, any hour of the day, there will be lots of men there working out. If you go down to the dock, there's people fishing, not just old people, young guys, also the traditional, sort of father figure in the home, that's changed as well. It's, a lot more, I think, shared responsibilities in the home, and, fathers playing with kids in the park and stuff like that, so it's definitely not difficult to reach men in Japan.
I remember when we first had this idea to plant a church. I've never planted a church before in my life, right? Now I'm doing it in another culture, in another language. And so I went to the Japanese pastor and I said, in Japanese, I said, "Kono hataraki ni bibitteru." Like, I'm really scared, terrified of this, right? And then he smiled and he said, "That's okay. I'm also really terrified, so let's just be terrified together."
I can't remember when I first heard the phrase, but it's one whose meaning has kind of become clear over the time living in Japan. And what are we called to is to live with faith and faithfulness, not to judge things on the visible results, because Japan is not a place where you see big results happening quickly in people's lives.
I think my big advice, and this applies probably to all believers everywhere, but is do it for Jesus. Do it for Jesus. So we easily slip into doing ministry for the fruit. We're not called to do that. We're called to follow Jesus. And it's as we remain in him that there is fruit born, whether we see it or not.
I think it would be good to pray that Japanese people would recognize the God who created all this beautiful nature and the food that they enjoy, as they recognize its beauty and wonderful taste, that they would long for the Creator. He may open their eyes to see him.